Mr. Capone. By Robert J. Schönberg. Preface. In the 1948 film State of the Union, when the character played by Spencer Tracy repented of having sold out his principles, he said, "I thought I could hijack the Republican nomination. I became an Al Capone of politics." Capone had been dead for over a year, and before that had been either in prison or vegetating in Florida for over 16 years. But director Frank Capra assumed his audience needed nothing further to know exactly what Tracy meant. When Imelda Marcos returned to the Philippines in November 1991, her lawyer scoffed at the government's charges of failure to file income tax returns. "They can't get her on the more serious charges," he said, "so they're trying to get her the way the U.S. government got Al Capone." That prosecution had occurred almost exactly 60 years before. But the lawyer knew that even in the Philippines everyone would know what he meant without further explanation. So did a New York Times op-ed writer in June 1989, when he argued that Vice President Quayle's asking El Salvador strongman Roberto Dubuisson not to embarrass the country's new president, Alfredo Cristiani, was like asking Al Capone to pay his taxes. So did a letter writer to the Los Angeles Times in October 1991, who, to express dismay at news that a convicted murderer had gotten hold of the jury's names and addresses, penned an impassioned shades of Al Capone. So do an astounding number of other letter writers, news writers, and novelists, who still evoke the name of a man who did nothing much to attract attention outside Chicago before 1926 or after 1931. A Chicago criminal lawyer, Julius Lucius Eccles, has taken to clipping such instances, commenting, "Amazing how often his name is used to spice up a story." Al Capone is more than a person, he has become an illusion. Al Capone was, beyond question, the world's best-known gangster, and one of the best-known Americans. His name is still recognized everywhere without any explanation needed about who he was or what he stands for, his value, of course, as an illusion. The city fathers of Cicero, Illinois, still occasionally ponder the wisdom of changing their town's name to Hawthorne, its citizens weary of the snide looks and cracks they receive wherever they go because Capone made Cicero his headquarters. Yet apart from the lurid events that have figured in a number of movies, like the St. Valentine's Day Massacre, Capone's story is actually so little known that movie makers have shown no compunction about ludicrous inventions and liberties with the facts, confident that audiences will not know enough simply to laugh at them. The powers of Cicero, for instance, are evidently unaware of Capone's intimate connection with the name Hawthorne. With Capone, the truth is not only stranger, but a good deal more fascinating than the fiction that has surrounded him. His story needs no embellishment. It does need serious treatment. This book is an attempt to demonstrate why he did what he did, how things looked to him, what led to his decisions. It's pointless to spend time deploring his criminality, inaccurate to make him out a grotesque. It's both more interesting and more instructive to see why even the lurid things happened. He was a businessman of crime and had lucid, rational, and discoverable reasons for his actions. That applies with equal force to most of those with whom he dealt on both sides of the law. This is a story of human beings, with a few arguable exceptions, whose actions, even when vicious or corrupt, stemmed from discernible human motives. There are 3 ways to make a gangster or hoodlum interesting, wrote film critic John Simon. He can be so brutally and unrestrainedly criminal that he compels our attention, or he can be a master criminal of such cunning incompetence he mocks all punishment until some simple, unexpected human flaw betrays him, or he can be, for all his criminality, so human he inspires thoughts of, there, but for the grace of God. Again and again, Al Capone exemplified, in turn, all 3. Chapter 1. A twig grows in Brooklyn, and is bent.
All I ever did was to sell beer and whiskey to our best people. All I ever did was to supply a demand that was pretty popular. Why, the very guys that make my trade good are the ones that yell the loudest about me. Some of the leading judges use the stuff. When I sell liquor, it's called bootlegging. When my patrons serve it on silver trays on Lakeshore Drive, it's called hospitality.
Gabriel Capone picked a rotten time to bring his young family to America. At age 28, with a 23-year-old wife, the former Teresa Raiola, their year-old son and another on the way, Gabriel left Castellamare di Stabia, his native village 16 miles down the bay from Naples. They landed in New York just in time for the Panic of 1893, which would rack the country's economy for years. Gabriel wisely chose Brooklyn as home in preference to the even greater squalor and density of Mulberry Bend, Manhattan's Lower East Side Italian colony. Not that the Depression spared Brooklyn. Unemployment would soon idle 1/4 of the borough's workforce, making it no time for the unskilled. Yet most Italians who arrived in America then lacked skills that could land them decent urban jobs. The Industrial Revolution had largely bypassed their part of Italy. Nearly 97% of them had been peasants. Why did so many flock to the cities? Why didn't they look for farm jobs or continue west to homestead what remained of the frontier? First, they had emigrated to escape a rural life they could conceive of only as brutal and dehumanizing. They came to better themselves, not suffer more of the same. The second reason bore more directly on Gabriel Capone's experience in America. However hard, his lot was easier than that of most Italian immigrants because he did possess an urban trade. He was a barber, which implied considerable skill at a time when many still visited barbers to be bled and have teeth yanked. Even so, Gabriel could not practice his trade right off the boat, because like his fellows, he had no money. The average Italian immigrant family in the 90s had just $17 when they landed, enough to sustain them at best for 10 to 12 days. That meant most could not have searched for farm work or traveled to it even had they wanted. They took what they could get, which they could seldom get on their own. Most spoke no English. They typically became virtual chattel, recruited by one of the padroni, entrepreneurial countrymen who would sell the newcomers services in work gangs to perform the most backbreaking labor at the lowest pay. One Italian later recalled bitterly his daily 10 hours with pick and shovel for only $1, with a Saturday night kickback of 1 day's pay to the foreman, followed by the present of a chicken at each Monday's shape-up if he hoped to work that week. That arrangement was extreme. More usual was the hod carrier who pulled down a good $1.50 for his 10 hours, 15 cents for each hour lugging bricks up ladders. For Gabriel, lack of capital meant he could not open his own shop, and with haircuts and shaves a nickel each, no one could support a growing family barbering for someone else. Those nickels represented the other side of depressed wages. Prices had to match, which usually meant immigrants could afford only the dregs. For dollars a month rented a 2-room apartment with bare walls, no gas or electricity, water carted in from a pump in the yard, a communal privy out back. A really poor family might cook on a kerosene stove, which doubled as their only source of heat. The better off fed chestnut-sized coals into a pot-bellied iron stove. No one considered heating both rooms, not with coal at 35 cents for a 100-pound bag. In winter, says someone who lived like that, our place was just a little hotter than outside. His mother refrigerated food by storing it in the bedroom. Some weren't that well off. One investigator found 5 families, 20 people, sharing a single room, 12 feet by 12 feet, with 2 beds, no partitions, screens, tables or chairs. The Capones lived better than most. Though Gabriel could not ply his trade at first, he avoided the drudgery and extreme low pay of manual labor because he boasted another skill that went with his trade: he could read and write. In Italy, as well as in America, the illiterate expected their barber to read them any letters that came their way. Gabriel's learning earned him a job in a grocery store until he could gather enough of a stake to open his own barber shop, a storefront in the tenement at 69 Park Avenue. Children came. The Capones christened theirs with Italian names, though except for one, all of them grew up known by American equivalents. Vincenzo, born in Italy the year after the Capones' 1891 marriage, was called Jimmy in America. Raffaello, born not long after they landed in 1893, was Ralph. Salvatore, always known as Frank, was born in 1895. Teresa had her 4th son on January 17, 1899, a mild Tuesday. Exactly 3 weeks later, on February 7th, the infant's godmother, Sophia Milo, bundled him off to the church where Teresa prayed with devout regularity, the cramped, in-a-basement St. Michael the Archangel, on Lawrence Street at the corner of Tillery in downtown Brooklyn. The Reverend Father Joseph Garofalo baptized him Alphonsus, Latin for Alfonso. Later, many would claim that his family name was really Capone, the implication being that he had Americanized it. In fact, his last name, at baptism, was spelled with an E. And since the church required only one sponsor, he would grow with the guidance of no godfather. When little Al came along, the Capones lived at 95 Navy Street, 5 blocks from St. Michael's, bordering the New York Naval Shipyard, better known as the Brooklyn Navy Yard. Predictably, the neighborhood was rough, Sand Street especially. Conveniently dead-ending on Navy Street at the Navy Yard gate, Sands offered all the diversions suggested by the phrase, drunken sailors. In uniforms customized at Max Cohn's, sailors could swagger into the saloons that lined Sands, then stagger out to the attendant pickup dance halls, brothels, hotbed rooming houses, pawn shops, and tattoo parlors. Sands was a street, as one of its historians put it, of cheap liquor and even cheaper women. The occasional penitent might patronize the Naval YMCA. The few other savory establishments that graced Sands underlined what made this a strange neighborhood for a family named Capone. McIntyre's candy store stood on Sands, as did McLean's livery stable, Seeney's harness shop and Martin Connolly's saloon, for Sands marked the southern boundary of Irishtown. Italian families had colonized the Navy Yard district, but the Capones inhabited the borderland. At the turn of the century, even tiny St. Michael's could comfortably accommodate the number of Italian communicants thereabouts. Not long after little Al's birth, Gabriel took his brood away from the blatant vice of Sand Street to one of 3 apartments over his barber's shop at 69 Park, removing the family even further from their countrymen. The Capone household included 2 boarders, a help with the rent, Michael Martino, also a barber, perhaps Gabriel's shop assistant, and a greenhorn musician, just off the boat, Andrea Calabrese. The other families at 69 Park were Irish, the McBrides, and the Radigans. Although Irish names predominated on the block and surrounding streets, other nationalities also flourished, Swedes and Germans, 3 Chinese at 79 Park, and, great rarity, a native-born family of at least the 2nd generation, the Swifts at 55 Park. A few other Italians lived near, like the 3-family enclave around the corner on North Portland Avenue, but little Al spent his first 6 or 7 years surrounded by foreigners, escaping the insularity felt by most immigrants of all nations who usually clustered in homogeneous ghettos. That exposure would strongly influence a vital factor in his development as the businessman of crime. Like the Capones, most Italian immigrants to America between 1881 and 1911 came from the impoverished and unremittingly downtrodden south of Italy or from Sicily. That region had seldom known anything but raids, pillage and tyrannical misrule, usually by literal foreigners, never by anyone except those they considered outsiders. Greeks, Carthaginians, Romans, Arabs, Normans, the Spanish, the French, all in turn had ravaged Sicily in Italy's boot. Smoldering resentment against foreigners and mistrust of all authority became tradition. For those crushed people, Italian history was neither an academic subject nor a recital of national glories. Most immigrants first heard the names Michelangelo and Leonardo in America. When they saw a statue of Columbus, it appeared to them another monument to another patron. For them history remained a living, cautionary tale of outrage and injustice. Once upon a time, an immigrant in Brooklyn used to intone as a bedtime story for his sleepy nephews, there were in Sicily many latifondi estates. Then after that Figlio Puttana from France who called himself Napoleon invaded Sicily, there was great trouble. Just before that, in the late 1700s, Italy resembled a butcher's chart of meat cuts. The leg belonged to Spanish Bourbons, both northern shoulders to Austria, the rump of Tuscany to Spanish Habsburgs, the midsection to the Pope. Italians ruled themselves only in the northwest Piedmont. When brief unification came, it naturally started with foreign invasion. The Figlio Puttana twice swept down the peninsula, welding all but the Spanish Bourbons' reactionary kingdom of Naples into an Italian republic, with himself emperor, his family and generals viceroys. Even this interlude of mock nationhood ended after Waterloo. The Congress of Vienna returned Italy to political chaos. The country remained pastoral and poor, owned by everyone except the Italian people. That finally changed after 1848, in the Europe-wide ferment of popular revolts. But for the benighted South, nationhood meant little. Now they found themselves oppressed by the more prosperous North. Lashed by hunger, the peasants sporadically erupted in revolt. The government was centered in Rome, peopled largely by better educated, more successful Northerners. Naturally, it had to squash insurrection, but that meant half of Italy's army, Northerners mostly, garrisoned the boot, another foreign army of occupation. Given such a history, mistrust of outsiders became a Southern Italian heritage, directed not just toward other nationalities, plus obvious oppressors, like Romans and Tuscans, but among themselves. Neapolitans learned to fear and despise Calabrians, who loathed Puglians, who scorned Basilicates, and back again, a round robin of detestation. All suspected Sicilians, who trusted no one. For little Al, such attitudes, inevitably absorbed from his Neapolitan parents, were offset by spending his most formative years in the midst of the others. That may account for his later lack, with, as we'll see, one startling exception, of any demonstrated national, regional, or religious prejudice, a notable factor in his success. On May 25, 1906, Gabriel forswore allegiance to the King of Italy, and in a fine, firm hand signed his naturalization certificate, using the Italian spelling of his first name, Gabriele. Native-born little Al already possessed citizenship. Teresa bore two more sons, Amadeo Ermino, in 1901, later called John and nicknamed Mimi, presumably from Ermino, and a few years later, Umberto, whom everyone called just Albert from the start, though more formally Albert John. The year 1907 found them a family of 8, however, not 9, because Jimmy had run off 2 years before, lost to the family Ken until years later, when he would suddenly reappear, a lawman from Nebraska. The homogenized nature of Park Avenue made no professional difference to Gabriel. Almost half the barbers in greater New York were Italians, a people thought to possess some special gift for snipping hair, patronized by all. But he and Teresa, more likely she, whose English never progressed far, hankered to live among their own. In 1907, when they could afford to, they moved about 1.5 miles south to a much better neighborhood, called South Brooklyn, just over the line from Park Slope, next door to the tough Irish section of Red Hook, yet the very heart of Brooklyn's Little Italy. They moved first to 21, Garfield Place, later into the upstairs of a framed duplex at 38, Garfield Place. Little Al had started school at John J. PS 7, at 141 York, near the Navy Yard. After the move, he transferred to William A. Butler, PS 133, at 355, Butler Street, 7 blocks away from Garfield. Until he reached 6th grade, he maintained a B average, testament to his natural brightness, since he devoted much time and energy to his favorite extracurricular activity, playing hooky. In the 6th grade it caught up with him. One term he attended class only 33 days of the required 90, falling so far behind in arithmetic and grammar he had to repeat the grade. He never did. A red haze temper that would occasionally overmaster him all his life exploded one day, and he hit a teacher who was lecturing him on some schoolroom misdemeanor. Sent to the principal, he got a whipping, and quit school in chagrin. He was 14 at the time, and about ready to quit anyway. That was practically a family tradition for Capone's sons. Older brother Frank had lasted barely through half of the 6th grade at Butler. Only the last son, Matthew Nicholas, always called just Matthew, born 1908, made it to high school. In a nearby pool hall Al played with his father, becoming renowned for his ability with a cue. He may have pitched sandlot baseball well enough to cherish dreams of turning pro, except for the same problem he had in school, lack of control. Big for his age, he combined athletic agility with heft and size, as shown by his later prowess as a barroom bouncer and ballroom dancer. He would grow to 5 feet 10.5 inches in a day when Jim Jeffries could punch his way to the world heavyweight boxing title weighing 175. Between racks and pitches, Al made a stab at an assortment of honest jobs: clerk in a candy store, pin boy in a bowling alley. For a while he earned $23 a week working in an ammunition factory. He also worked as cutter in a book bindery, following his older brother Ralph, who had worked in the print shop of a newspaper. Apprenticeship for Al Capone's life's work, though, came on the streets. Immigrant Brooklyn existed in their moldering tenements. They lived on the streets, the Italians more than any others. No one else's streets in Brooklyn, wrote one social historian, were so given over to unrestrained life. The immigrants recreated faithfully as possible the outdoor piazza living they had known back home. Everything possible was done out of doors and in the companionship of neighbors and friends. The streets Capone traveled as a boy were ruled by gangs, or more precisely kid gangs, because the word by itself can easily mislead. Members of these kid gangs could not be called gangsters. By today's standards they would barely qualify as delinquents. Excepting petty pilferage and occasional lunch money extortion, few engaged in activity anyone would consider downright criminal. One gang's notion of fun was to storm down a street, bowling over pushcarts and milk cans, scattering bread bins while helping themselves to trifles of merchandise, breaking windows and street bulbs, pulling old men's beards. Another group specialized in bonfires heaped with palings ripped from fences and the wood of unattended wagons, the pep rally usually dispersed by cops and firemen. One of the fiercer Jewish gangs in the Williamsburg section regularly smashed the windows of a Christian mission set in their midst. Milder rivals contented themselves with periodic snackadances through the mission to disrupt meetings, chanting, "We'll all stand up for Jesus, we'll all stand up for Jesus," until they exited on the punchline, "For the love of Christ, sit down." Gangs with longer traditions might possess a clubhouse, a room in an abandoned building or a storefront, sparsely furnished, where members could play cards, shoot craps, smoke American Beauty cigarettes, sold for a penny, or just hang out. None of these pleasures touched the real reason for membership. Slum kids had to belong to a gang for protection and survival, certainly psychic, perhaps physical. Their vocation was fighting. One Irish kid later recalled finding himself in a fistfight at least 2 or 3 times a week from age 12. No one picked on him in the classic sense of bullies tormenting a scrawny kid. On the contrary, he was strong for his age, like Capone. His existence presented a challenge. One-on-one fistfights were the least of it. They merely settled intramural discipline, disagreements, and pecking orders. Real clashes came between gangs for violations of turf or to gain prestige. All saw themselves as beset, surrounded by enemies, and all were right. A Jewish gang member in Brooklyn later recalled that the Irish could be said to fight almost for the fun of it, while the Jews always fought in self-defense. That strong Irish kid remembered a different Brooklyn. Anytime he and his pals crossed the line into a Jewish neighborhood, even an innocent passage on a trolley, trouble threatened. The Jewish boys did not like anyone in their neighborhood who did not look like themselves, he wrote years later, and would drive us away. Italian kids faced that extra hazard of their parents' traditional enmities had Capone, the Neapolitan, ventured to eastern Flushing Avenue, not far from his old home. He might have become Scarface several years earlier. Sicilians reigned there. Like the other kids, he had to join a kid gang for safety. What distinguished him from most was that he joined as though answering a call. Al joined the South Brooklyn Rippers, a junior gang that inducted kids as young as 11. Hanging out part-time on Manhattan's Lower East Side, where Brother Ralph now operated and would soon come fleetingly to police attention with a crooked auto sale, Al also joined the 40 Thieves Juniors, a more significant alliance. This was an elite offshoot of the junior branch of the notorious 5 Points, an adult gang. Membership in the Manhattan Gang showcased his tough scrappiness under the noses of those who could best appreciate and employ it if, like some, he chose to join a serious adult gang at age 15 or 16. No reliably authentic details about AL's activities in his late boyhood and early teens have survived, but he evidently did not stand out or apart. Not many years later, a former Brooklyn Kid gang member remembered him as something of a nonentity, affable, soft of speech and even mediocre. So, when this Brooklyn boy made good in the world, the surprise was general among his old friends and acquaintances. Of course he chose the path that led from kid gangs to the real thing. As the same gang member put it, the greater number passed on to become good citizens. They would drop out of gangs to get jobs or go on in school. Plainly, each kid's choice had to be at least partly a conscious decision. But circumstance could force the issue, as could association and opportunity, as with AL's membership in the 40 Thieves Juniors. Two influences, the first overarching and long run, the other immediate, tipped the scale for Al. From the start, John Torrio was the thinking man's criminal. Born 1882 in Orsara di Puglia, almost 60 miles east of Naples, Torrio came to New York in his mother's arms at age 2, his father dead in an accident before migration. Maria Torrio and John lived 2 years with her brother while she worked as a seamstress. Then she married Salvatore Caputo, and Torrio got his start. Exactly what kind of start depended on which story Torrio told to which audience for which purpose. Once, when a judge was about to pass sentence, Torrio claimed that stepfather Caputo ran a blind pig behind windows that made 86 James Street look like any other Mulberry Bend grocery store, selling moonshine and beer, unlicensed and untaxed, therefore cheaper. Little Johnny toiled there as a porter, starting at age 7, able to snatch only 13 months of formal education. Plainly he had missed all the advantages that might have kept him straight. On a different occasion, to convince U.S. immigration of his worthiness to remain a citizen, he lent himself as a Horatio Alger lad pluckily pursuing high school education at night after exhausting days as delivery boy for his stepfather, this time a real grocer. Torrio always knew what people wanted to hear. In 1901, age 19, he promoted boxing. New York then permitted only amateur bouts, a fatuous attempt to curtail fixing. Canny impresarios like Torrio, who campaigned under the name J. T. McCarthy, could rig odds and dictate profitable dives with amateurs as readily as with pros. Prospering, Torrio bought a bar on James Street at the corner of Water. He soon expanded, leasing a rooming house down the block which he filled with whores, a natural business fit offering the kind of service his clientele wanted, as did the nearby store he converted into a pool hall. From such a customer base he easily recruited likely-looking layabouts for the capstone of his small conglomerate, the James Street Boys, his own gang, whose jobs he planned and whose loot he fenced. He was always scrupulous about the split. John Torrio never looked to cheat a soul. He proclaimed what would become his lifelong motto, "There's plenty for everyone." Few gang leaders shared that principle, but then Torrio differed in many ways. At the minimum, most matched their henchmen for brawn. Not that many in the gangs towered. Police measured the average arrestee at only 5 feet 3 inches, weighing under 135. But hard labor from boyhood had steeled most of them amazingly. Torrio, however, dominated his swollen-muscled thugs with a large brain abetted by a colossal nerve and will, all seated in a puny, flaccid body, with chipmunk cheeks, a little potbelly, and dainty soft hands and feet. He knew how to turn his very puniness into an asset of control, the shrimp being somehow all the more terrible when he can set a hulking subordinate cringing because the hulk knows other hulks stand ready to enforce the shrimp's word. Equally important, Torrio knew when to make alliances, and with whom, and when to cut ties that had started to bind. Monk Eastman typified the era's gang leader, shading over the average at 5 feet 5 inches and 150 pounds, a walking slab of muscle who prided himself on never blackening a woman's eye, putting a shanty on her glimmer, without first removing his brass knuckles, and never, no matter how sorely provoked, using his club on her. Eastman's gang unceasingly fought territorial wars with Paul Kelly's 5 Points Gang, historic successor to the Wyos, named probably for their battle cry. Gangs had ranged over lower Manhattan for nearly 100 years, first the antebellum 40 Thieves, ancestor only in name of Al Capone's Kid Gang, shirt tails. They wore them as a uniform outside their trousers, plug uglies, protected their heads with stiff plug hats, dead rabbits. Rabbit was slang for rowdy, dead for very, as in dead game, Chichesters, roach guards, black eagles. At the turn of our century, 2 survivors terrorized the area. The 5 Points Gang took its name from the heart of its territory, the confluence of 5 streets, now merged into 3, Baxter, Worth, and Park Row, notorious then as a Coney Island of vice for the poor, now site of several courthouses. Of 99 places of amusement on the Bowery in 1898, the police counted only 14 respectable. Without dispute, the 5 Pointers preyed on everything between Broadway and the Bowery, 14th Street and City Hall Park. Eastman's unchallenged territory lay from Bowery to the East River, 14th Street to Monroe. The clash came over who owned whoring, gambling, booze, and extortion rights in the strip between Pell Street and Bowery. 2 years of mayhem and murder had settled nothing. John Torrio allied his James Streeters with the 5 Points Gang, which, about 1,500 strong, figured to win eventually. More important, their leader was to Torrio what Torrio would become to Al Capone, model and mentor, almost idol. Paul Kelly's real name was Paolo Antonini Vaccarelli. He pegged in somewhere between Torrio and Eastman as the image of a turn-of-the-century New York gang leader. He stood below average in height, but swung the muscular bulk of a one-time boxer. Yet he had educated himself, read extensively, liked good music, dressed with conservative good taste, spoke softly and well, even a smattering of French, Italian, and Spanish, an accomplishment that then marked, except in immigrants, of course, the cultured gentleman. Kelly admired Torrio's mind, its acuity reflected in the slickness of the James Street Boys' coups, but he found that mind unformed, untutored. He adopted Torrio as protege, offered him hints on how to develop himself. Torrio sponged it up. Soon he too dressed in chaste dark suits and stolid derbies instead of checkered trousers and Yankees caps. Soon Torrio too hummed opera motifs. Warfare continued until an overly public shootout left 3 dead and 20 wounded, including 3 bystanders who hadn't dived for cover quickly enough. Tammany, fearing political backlash, dictated a truce. It held, but only uneasily, broken by frequent border skirmishes. By the early 1900s, Torrio recognized what had become a deteriorating situation. Lower Manhattan no longer recommended itself to one who simply wanted to conduct the peaceful business of crime. Torrio sold his James Street holdings, gave the boys his blessing, bade Kelly sad goodbye, and relocated to Brooklyn, where he could expect respectable Italians to accept what he handed them with quiet dignity and in peace, whether as customers or victims. That was part of the Italian immigrants' tradition and of their American experience. Until about 1875, the United States viewed Italians with sympathetic admiration, even affection. When Giuseppe Mazzini and his warrior disciple, Giuseppe Garibaldi, led Italy in its long struggle for independence and unification, they seized the imagination of Americans. The 2 Italians seemed obvious analogues of our own founding fathers. In the city of Washington, a crowd celebrated the Italian people's glorious struggle to free themselves from the despotism of a foreign power. When the nominally Republican French armies rushed in to prop up the old regimes, a 4th of July resolution in Philadelphia's Independence Square voted Francis Louis Philippe, the Iscariot of liberty, the Benedict Arnold of the Old World. Even the Know-Nothings, America's first organized movement in reaction to immigration, exempted Italians from their bigotry. The repression Italians had suffered and their freedom-loving bravery somehow absolved them of being foreign and Roman Catholic in know-nothing minds. It helped immensely that, at first, most Italians stayed in Naples and Palermo and Rome to suffer their martyrdom. The 1850 census counted only 3,045 Italians throughout the United States. Not until 1870 did Italian immigration to the United States exceed 2,000 a year. Furthermore, those who came posed no threat, even to know-nothings. They were mostly artisans and professionals from North and Central Italy. As one writer put it in 1881, with a retrospective sigh, higher walks of American life. Long included many talented and charming Italians, the likes of Lorenzo da Ponte, once Mozart's lyricist, who arrived in 1805, and of Garibaldi himself, who fled to U.S. exile in 1850. Increasingly horrid conditions impelled southern Italians to emigrate. Corsair raids that lasted until almost 1800 had forced the people inland to defensible hill towns, forsaking the fertile coast and lowlands, which devolved into marshes and malarial swamps, while the refugees scratched flinty hillsides. Centuries of overcultivation and deforestation had blasted even that subsistence farming land, and now political upheavals further deranged the economy. At first, the unskilled, job-seeking competition chose the warmer, more familiarly Latin South America. Many worked there in the local summer, returning to Italy for spring planting. Long after that pattern changed, southern Italians called both American continents Laggiù, down there. By the 1870s, South America could not absorb all those who had to escape starvation in the south of Italy, where no one tasted meat save perhaps a scrap at Christmas and Easter, where families could afford a glass of wine only for the men, who dragged themselves back from the fields each day, desperate for some restorative after the day's sweat. Spaghetti became a treat. Well into our century, wrote an Italian newsman, millions of Italians still lived a life of prehistoric squalor. America's post-Civil War expansion demanded new pools of unskilled labor. Though only 12,354 Italians landed in 1880, that was more than the total number even of Italian descent in the United States 11 years before. Soon came a deluge, 100,135 in 1900, over 200,000 in 1903, a peak of 285,731 in 1907. These were not Mazzinas, Garibaldis, da Pontes. They weren't even John Martini's, Custer's trumpeter, providentially sent away with a message for reinforcements before the Little Bighorn. They were, observed one commentator, the most disadvantaged and humble white people that other Americans had ever seen. At the turn of the century, 22.9% of all immigrants to the United States could neither read nor write. Northern Italians cut that rate in half, 11.4%. Among Southern Italians, illiteracy soared to 57.3%. They also tended to look the most different of all immigrants, shorter, darker. The differences, the disadvantages, and especially the competition for jobs in such numbers occasioned extremes of prejudice. In the 1850s, New Orleans had voted a resolution praising Italians for their struggle of right and justice against brute force and tyranny in their most odious forms. On the 14th of March, 1891, after Italians had moved among them, a New Orleans mob broke into the jail, shot 9 Italian fishermen in their cells, and hanged 2. The 11 had been arrested on the most tenuous evidence that some might have murdered the city's police superintendent, though 6 of them had already been acquitted, 3 had faced hung juries, and 2 had not yet been tried. Other vigilance committees in such communities as Tampa, Denver, and Johnson City, Illinois, lynched Italians in 1893, 95, 96, 99, 1901, 06, 10, 14, and 15. Yet despite the prejudice and stunted opportunities, the Italians boasted one of the lowest rates of pauperism of any immigrant group. Only a tiny fraction ever applied for relief. Those who could not dig, picked rags. Some paid the Irish who operated garbage scows to let them trim the loads, salvaging rags, bones, and other such saleable treasures. That's what most people have missed, says a former Chicago chief of detectives, himself Italian. When you look at Capone or any Italian gangsters back then, the key is the aggressiveness of all the Italians. They would do anything to get ahead. An Italian newspaperman, contemplating all they had to put up with, wrote that the Italian immigrant who did not become a criminal, or go mad, was a saint. Actually, the overwhelming majority were none of the above. In 1924, Dr. Antonio Stella, protesting America's newly restrictive immigration policy, pointed out that the average criminality of the foreign-born Italian is less than that of most of the other races and only slightly more than that of the white Native American population. The arrest rate averaged 158.1 out of 100,000 Italians, while the figure for German-born was 218.9, for English 488.3, and Irish 1,540.1. Even the Swiss outdid the Italians in crime, at 167.4. Still, in southern Italian tradition, crime remained a reasonably honorable alternative way of getting ahead. An 1863 Italian parliamentary report on conditions in the South had admitted that the existence of a bandit has many attractions there for the poor laborer, who anyway harbored an absolute lack of confidence in the law and the exercise of justice. In America, an understanding Yankee writer pointed out that insufferable tyranny had made every outlaw dear to the hearts of the oppressed people. Even if he robbed them, they felt that he was the lesser of two evils and sheltered him from the authorities. The hostile reception they met in America did nothing to decrease the bunker outlook of Southern Italians or incline them to side with authority against even the depredations of those who were at least their own. John Torrio quickly re-established himself in Brooklyn. He may have patronized Gabriel's shop occasionally. In any case, young Al could hardly have avoided absorbing the lesson of someone who had attained money and power without the drudgery that weighed on most others. The John Torrio Association, probably his headquarters, occupied the second floor over a restaurant where 4th Avenue, the main north-south arterial through South Brooklyn, met Union, the neighborhood's principal market street. The corner sat on Al's way to PS 133, gilt letters brave on the association's windows, constant reminder that some crime pays handsomely. In 1909, still before 10-year-old Al could fall directly into the orbit of 27-year-old Torrio, the chubby little man received a call to Chicago. As we'll see, that move would occasion the biggest single influence in Al's life. More immediately, Al had caught the eye of someone who could exert the most portentous influence possible at that stage. It was Frankie Yale, 6 years older, who had ushered Al into the 40 Thieves Juniors. When Al entered his mid-teens, Yale welcomed him into the adult gang and gave him a job. The family baptized their children and buried their dead under the name of Iole, pronounced Yoile. Frank, Francesco, universally called Frankie, was born in 1893 in Calabria, near the toe of Italy's boot, and brought to New York at age 9. A member of 5 Points Junior's kid gang, as soon as he was old enough he joined the 5 Pointers. Their days of glory had passed, but the 5 Points remained a serious gang in the modern, adult sense. Joining was a career decision, on the order of entering some corporate training program. At about the time Torrio left for Chicago, Frank Iole Americanized and disguised his name to Yole. Though of only medium height, with a tendency toward plumpness, he was chunky and tough, with a square face, broad, fleshy nose and lips, and lobeless ears that hugged his head. Like Torrio, he had small, delicate hands, unusual for his body size, the more so because he brawled happily and with authority. At age 17, he and a friend, who wrestled under the name of Booby Nelson, cleaned out Kister's Coney Island pool hall, curling billiard balls and swinging cues. Kister's location was meaningful. Also like Torrio, Yole spied more opportunity in Brooklyn than in Lower Manhattan. 2 years later police picked him up on a gun-toting charge, which, like the time he stole some $300 worth of sheep and goat skins, came to little. Extortion paid better. After some unimaginative juvenile racketeering, Yole organized the ice trade. He sold the Eisman protection in monopoly territories, which he rigorously enforced. With the money he made from this scheme he opened a bar in Coney Island. At about the same time, 1917, at age 24, he married Maria DeLapia, with whom he would have 2 daughters, Rosa and Isabella. He and Maria lived in Brooklyn in a house owned by her parents. At the same time, he started using the name Yale in place of Yole despite Maria's disapproval. The most successful Coney Island night spot then was the College Inn. Yale, who tried parting his thick black hair in the middle for a while, in emulation of the prevalent collegiate style, hoped to hitchhike on that success, calling his place the Harvard Inn. That made the new spelling of his name a regular thigh-slapper, good for business. It also further disguised him, further shielding his family. A dive, though a large one, the Harvard and occupied a one-story building on Bowery, a short but seedy alley running between Surf and what would soon become the boardwalk. An orchestra in the back played for drinkers and diners who could grope each other as they shuffled about the 40 by 20-foot dance floor. Drinks flowed from a 20-foot-long bar. Frankie Yale put Al Capone behind that bar. Close students of Capone literature will wonder why I don't cite the material in My Years with Capone, which purports to be an interview with Jack Woodford, a mild pornographer from the 1930s and 40s. The book includes a wealth of supposed confidences by Capone about exactly this period. It is a double hoax. The interview was not with Woodford, but with a Chicago lawyer, Louise Kuttner, and evidence suggests that Kuttner never knew Capone. Certainly most of the statements of fact about himself that I could check proved false. I also ignore a couple of other published anecdotes about this period in another book, otherwise fine and honest, which don't make sense, even internally. Interested readers will find a complete discussion in the notes. Chapter 2. Early Maturity. By the time Al Capone turned 16, maturity in that hothouse of dangers, pressures, and responsibilities, he battled both as a member of the 5 Points Gang in Manhattan and for Frankie Yale in Brooklyn. The latter connection was the more important because while the 5 Points Gang's importance and scope continued to dwindle, Yale's blossomed. Capone learned all there was to know about extortion and slugging and the rest on the banks of the Gowanus Canal, says William Balsamo, Brooklyn native and historian of New York crime. Yale was fashioning a complex of enterprises beyond the Harvard Inn, a mortuary, racehorses, prize-fighters, another night spot, the Sunrise Cafe, around the corner from his home, a line of cigars, all based finally on his main line, strong-arm terror. Though his troops might pull the occasional freelance robbery or stick-up, Yale was not a thief in the street sense, and Capone would later take pride in not being one himself. Instead, Yale specialized in varieties of extortion, shylocking, lending workmen money at 20% each week, exacting tribute from the bookmakers, pimps and gamblers in his territory, offering shopkeepers protection for a regular fee, organizing vertical associations, as with the ice sellers, from whose members he collected dues, in return fixing prices that guaranteed artificially high markups, with any who dared undercut prices instantly punished. Muscle in one form or another powered most of Yale's dealings. True, he offered those breaking the vice laws real protection from arrest and prosecution, and what he offered honest merchants included real protection from unlicensed predators, other extortionists, and from the more unreasonable exactions of such petty authorities as beat cops and fire and health inspectors. Nevertheless, the main protection he sold was from what he himself would otherwise order done. Bookies, pimps and shopkeepers alike kicked in tribute, or else, borrowers paid his juice, and on time, or else. So Yale needed a stable of strong-arms who could not only break arms and heads but would kill. As with most gangs at the time, the availability of such muscle made Yale, its proprietor, courted by politicians who needed election help, and who, in turn, provided the political clout inherent in the protection Yale sold. This was classic racketeering. An FBI study identified the practice as age-old, but traced the word to the late 1800s when gangs like the 5 Points gave dances called rackets. The gangs unloaded blocks of tickets to merchants who had no intention of attending but feared the consequences of refusal. Even Yale's seemingly legitimate enterprises ranked as rackets, since muscle animated them also. The cigars, for instance, whose boxes bore his likeness, commanded more shelf space than their quality merited because merchants dared not say no. Once, when he needed someone to run his new Sunrise Cafe, Yale simply appropriated the popular manager of another club, never consulting contrary wishes of the man or his former boss. At the same time, Yale recognized the need to treat the buying public as much as possible like customers, not victims. His sales pitch could not widely be, use my undertaking service or get buried yourself, or dance at the Harvard Inn or I'll have your legs broken. As we'll see, the need for greater subtlety in pressuring the public gave Capone his chance to gain Yale's favor and to reveal the first glimmer of the person Capone would become. Capone joined Yale at the pregnant moment, just as Yale started his play for the big time. Yale had his eye on possibilities throughout Brooklyn, especially on its 5-mile stretch of waterfront with its 60-odd piers, dense with pluckable merchandise and men. Frustratingly, the Irish were already there plucking away. Dennis Meehan led the White Hand Gang. They called themselves that despite Yale's outfit, which newspapers called it Black Hand Gang, because that's what they automatically called all Italian criminals. Actually, by then Black Hand extortion, which we'll examine in the next chapter, figured only modestly in Yale's operation. What's more, few gangs had formal names outside newspaper columns. A gangster who had to identify himself to others would say, "I'm with Frankie Yale, I'm with Torrio, eventually, I'm with Capone." Those with Frankie Yale found those with Denny Meehan hard to displace. Irish immigration had antedated Italian by decades. The Irish had long since organized the docks, cowing the shipping companies and the longshoremen. The Italians could supplant Irish authority only pier by pier, shylocking a few stevedores here, muscling a shipper there, each time having to convince the prey that they, no longer the Irish, were the ones to fear, then defending gains against Irish counterattack. While the fighting never escalated to pitched battles, gangsters did die, and need for muscle never abated. As a shylock and extortion collector, and as a territorial brawler, Capone shone, a tough, supple, hefty hooligan. An added dimension impressed Yale. His people did not spend full time shaking down dockers or potting at or grappling with white-handers. They helped man Yale's enterprises. Although muscle is unneeded for rolling cigars and inappropriate at funerals, it's treasured in a raucous night spot. Coney Island, on Brooklyn's South Shore, had started as an Atlantic Ocean bathing and amusement resort of some pretension when the principal transportation to it consisted of one's own tally-ho. The railways, the trolleys, and finally the subway ended that. Never again, mourned one Tory historian, would the world of fashion come to Coney except in small groups and those, indeed, slumming. Elegant restaurants had served clams and champagne to swells. Clams gave way to Charles Feltman and his discovery that a warmed Frankfurter sausage in a roll appealed to the masses. The name hot dog followed much later. Champagne. By 1900, on any warm Sunday, New York City police made half their drunk arrests at Coney Island, and champagne was not to blame. Prostitutes, blisters to the Coney locals, teemed. Some were streetwalkers, others inmates at famous houses like the Gut, Madame Corn's, Lillian Granger's Albatross and Mother Wayman's, where Princess Sazette titillated clients with a fish. Even in such company the Harvard ranked as a dive. Exactly because of that, Capone's job as bartender and bouncer demanded a certain finesse. In a dive, bounceable behavior tonight seldom makes the customer unwelcome tomorrow. The trick was to bounce without alienating, and only after considered efforts to calm, placate, and subdue had failed. Ideally, the bounced would recognize themselves as out of line. Capone combined the mass to bounce authoritatively and the intelligence to do it with tact. Yale liked what he saw. Capone became his pupil, favored by invitations after a hard night at the Harvard Inn to sleep over at Yale's house. That happened often enough so that much later Yale's daughters would show visitors A.L.'s room. Capone liked what he saw, too. Yale had 6 years on him, with the swagger of a young man, already boss yet still a comer. Inevitably Capone would take Yale for a model as well as teacher. Yale enforced discipline with unending obscenities, unrelenting and indiscriminate brutality. When displeased with his brother Angelo, 10 years his junior, Yale beat his brother into a hospital case. Concurrently, and this trait Capone would not have to unlearn, Yale played the gracious Don, a river of small benefactions to all who honored and respected him. Thieves robbed a poor delicatessen dealer. He found the cash on his counter next morning, replaced by Yale. A fish peddler lost his pushcart. Yale pressed $200 on him saying, "Get a horse, you're too old to walk." When two freelance hoods tried to shake down Frank Crespi, popular and colorful hat check operator at a neighboring restaurant, Yale personally beat the interlopers senseless. Dispensing largesse lay in the future for Capone. Yale's example of how brutality and coarseness built business made a more immediate impression. At 18, for all that his brain might grasp the need for on-the-job finesse, some buried beast in Capone threatened to burst out any moment. It happened one night with literally scarring consequences when his 18-year-old glands spoke louder than his brain. They called Frank Galluccio Gallic. Briefly a merchant seaman, a sometime barber's assistant, he discovered his true calling as a nothing hood, eventually a spear carrier in the Genovese crime family. One summer night in 1917 he strutted into the Harvard Inn, his date, Maria Tanzio, on his arm, his kid sister, Lena, tagging along. The sight of Lena set Capone's glands talking. He persisted in trying to make up to her, every time his rounds took him past her table trying to chat with her. Lena snubbed him. Her brother, half drunk, did not know Capone, but assumed from his familiarity that Lena did. At last, his kid sister's growing anger penetrated Galluccio's alcoholic fog. "You know that guy?" he asked. "I never saw him before. He's got a lot of nerve. He won't give up, Frank. He can't take a hint. But I don't like him, he is embarrassing me. Maybe you could ask him to please stop, in a nice way." Capone headed their way again, and Galluccio was ready to take him aside like a gent. "Hey, mister, please do me favor, okay? She's my kid sister, you know." Sweet reason never got a chance. Before Galluccio could speak, Capone hove to, leaned over Lena, and whispered, loud enough to startle the party at the next table, head swiveled in amazement, "You got a nice ass, honey, and I mean it as a compliment. Believe me." Her brother sprang to his feet. The insult was bad enough. The fact that strangers had plainly heard made it insupportable. "I won't take that shit from nobody," Galluccio shouted. "Apologize to my sister now, you hear?" At a moment, Capone's brain reasserted itself, perhaps kicked in by sister. Family meant everything, and its evocation put this customer unarguably in the right. With his most ingratiating, placating smile, Capone turned to Galluccio, arms spread wide, palms up and open. "Hey, what's the matter, pal? A little misunderstanding, a joke, no offense." "This is no fucking joke, mister," cried Galluccio. Capone stopped smiling but kept coming. "Some guys you can't reason with." Galluccio stood 5'6", weighed under 150. Capone looked like a mountain avalanching toward him. The Gallic knew he could be badly hurt unless he struck first and quickly, but his punch would never do the job. He clawed his knife from his pocket and lunged, as the streets had taught him, for his attacker's throat. Take into account Capone's athlete and brawler reflexes, plus Galluccio's drink-induced muzziness, and the little fellow aimed pretty well. One slash started 2 inches in front of mid-ear, curved 4 inches down the left cheek to just below the corner of Capone's mouth. The other 2 each measured 2.5 inches, one on the left jaw, the other on the neck under the left ear. Galluccio grabbed his sister and date and beat it out the door. Someone rushed Capone to the Coney Island Hospital, where doctors took about 30 stitches in his face. Soon Galluccio heard that some cut-up bruiser who said he was with Frankie Yale had been asking around for him. Galluccio appealed to Joseph Masurier, overlord of all New York, for justice. Joe the boss decreed a sit-down at the Harvard Inn, where their betters agreed that Capone had indeed been wrong and would not be allowed to seek vengeance, while Galluccio must apologize for his disproportionate reaction, which he readily did, contrite at sight of how he had disfigured Capone. Capone also recognized the justice of the settlement and the dishonor of his scars. He later put out the story that they had come to him in service with the Lost Battalion of World War I. In fact, he had never been called up in the draft. Until he left New York, whenever he encountered Galluccio, he steadily smiled his no hard feelings. He once told Galluccio he realized it had been wrong to insult his sister, especially so publicly. In his days of greatness, on visits to New York, Capone would hire Galluccio as a supernumerary bodyguard for $100 a week. That incident in no way diminished Frankie Yale's appreciation of his star pupil. Nor did 3 rousts by the law. Indeed, Capone was probably on some mission for Yale when police nabbed him on a disorderly conduct charge in Olean. What else would a Brooklyn boy be doing among the apple knockers of upstate New York? As for Capone's two early murders, they demonstrated a useful willingness to kill. The one about which details have survived displays Capone's hot head and cool reason. An acquaintance beat a neighborhood crap game for $1,500 or so. Downstairs, in the hallway, Capone poked a gun in the winner's belly and took the money. "You ought to be ashamed doing this to me. I know you good." What could Capone do? That clearly implied retaliation, either personal or, breaking the code, through the police. Capone shot the fool. The kid was wrong, he explained to Yale. He never should have said that, it was the wrong thing to say. It was his own fault he got shot. Yale understood. Although questioned by police, Capone was in the clear. No one knew or had seen a thing. He was getting dangerous, just the way Yale liked him. In 1918, Capone met an Irish girl at a dance and fell in love. She was pretty, slim and tall with a round piquant face and large eyes framed by a helmet of blonde hair. Baptized Mary, she would be known all her life as May, daughter of Michael Coughlin, a construction worker, and the former Bridget Gorman. Born April 4, 1897, May had almost 2 years on Capone, perhaps an embarrassment to them because each fudged a year of age on their marriage registration. Capone appears in the church records as Albert, maybe a mistake, or maybe a typical bit of criminal obfuscation. Italian-Irish matches were not common in those days. But Italian men did willingly marry young, whereas Irish men notoriously wanted to wait until much later in life, a point in favor of Italian men with Irish women. For his part, Capone harbored no prejudices. May's parents may have resisted the match, as much in distaste for Capone's vocation and associates as his origins. But on December 4, 1918, May gave birth. 18 days later, May's sister, Kathleen, and James Tavico, an otherwise obscure friend of Capone's, became godparents to Albert Francis Capone. Since Capone would soon marry May willingly, it's hard to imagine how an honest construction worker could enforce a shotgun marriage on a killer. Why didn't he do it before the birth of Sonny, as the boy would always be called? The answer is lost. But Capone did hurry the process, seeking dispensation to skip the publishing of banns. December 30, 1918, 8 days after he baptized Sonny, the Reverend Father James J. Delaney married Mayne Capone in the Coughlin's family church, St. Mary Star of the Sea, with May's sister Hannah as maid of honor, Tavico Albert's best man. Before marriage could mellow him, Capone's temper erupted again and changed everything. One day, on his collection rounds, he stopped in a dockside saloon for a drink. The stranger who ambled in was with Dinny Meehan's White Hand Gang. Neither Arthur Finnegan nor Capone had achieved prominence. Finnegan never would. They did not know each other. Finnegan's hobby, an extension of his vocation, was abusing Italians. This day in this saloon he picked the wrong one. Capone used nothing but those great ham-like fists, yet beat Finnegan so badly he thought he had left him for dead, an opinion shared by doctors for a considerable while. Finnegan languished weeks in the hospital. Police presented no problem, since as usual no one had seen or heard a thing or recognized a soul. The White-Handers were another matter, especially Meehan's chief lieutenant, William Lovett. He evoked fear from any sensible person. At 5 feet 6 or 7 inches, a frail-looking 150 pounds, brown-haired, with cupid bow mouth, doe eyes, fawn ears, he presented an elfin appearance. After the Meuse offensive in the Great War, the 77th Regiment had decorated Lovett with the Distinguished Service Cross for headlong bravery. Friends trod softly in his presence. He shot one of them for pulling a cat's tail. He could not abide the sight of small animals in distress. Gang bosses routinely traveled with a retinue of bodyguards. When Lovett succeeded to leadership after Meehan's murder in 1920, he still walked alone. He habitually packed a .45, and everyone knew he would as soon shoot you as look at you. This was a dangerous man. True, Artie Finnegan occupied a deservedly low rung in the gang. But someone had put a white-hander in the hospital barely clinging to life, and Bill Lovett would not stand it, all the more because that someone had almost surely been a greasy ginzo, one of Yale's. Question was, which one? Like Finnegan, no one in the saloon could put a name to the beefy youngster. Soon Yale got word that Lovett had set himself the task of identifying and tracking down Finnegan's mauler. How long could it take with the scars to help identification? Everyone knew what would happen. A highly efficient nemesis now stalked Capone. Had Capone remained single and childless, would he have waited for Lovett to come? Whether yes or no, Yale insisted on a different solution. A call to Johnny Torrio said everything. Of course Torrio could find a spot for the kid, always room for another reliable man. A year or two at the most, time enough for Lovett to cool down and stop looking. Al, you can come right back to Brooklyn. Always a place for you in Brooklyn. Now, though, in late 1919, Yale sent Capone to Chicago.